Hello, fellow interviewers. During a recent workshop, I gave my usual spiel about the inability for one human to accurately detect deception by assessing the body language of another. And I emphasized that there was no Pinocchio's nose to deceptive behavior. I presented the scientifically determined accuracy rate of 54%, which is akin to flipping a coin, and explained the perils of various biases that could accompany a technique scientifically proven to be no better than a guess. One student in the front row scratched his head and gave a puzzled look. He asked me how I would be able to find out if a witness was lying if we no longer used pseudoscientific body language assessment techniques. Good question. I explained that we would have to first get fine-grained detail from the witness, which could then be compared and contrasted with other evidence obtained during the investigation. He looked at me and asked if I had an example that would illustrate this process. Another good point. And that's when I got the mental image of a wonderful creature that I used to see while patrolling the Canadian prairies, the pronghorn, an antelope-like beast that could only be outrun by a cheetah and perhaps a turkey on Thanksgiving. Now, why did this animal come to mind? Because it was often used as an excuse by motorists who had drifted into the ditch of the Trans-Canada Highway when they had, in reality, fallen asleep at the wheel. Yes, this poor pronghorn was often falsely accused of causing these single vehicle collisions, and the only witness was usually the driver who ended up in the ditch. Now, interviewing a pronghorn was not an option, as they rarely say anything important. I got to say that pronghorns do dart across the highway and, as I once experienced firsthand, launch themselves into the occasional vehicle. However, that didn't mean that every driver who blamed a pronghorn was indeed telling the truth. So, what did a pronghorn have to do with the student's question? Well, when we were interviewing drivers who had expressed an agenda blaming the pronghorn for darting in front of them, we learned it was useful to instruct them to tell us what happened and raise that cognitive load by asking for fine-grained detail. This often included a teach-to-talk example and open breadth questions such as, what happened before that? Or, and then what happened? We wanted as much detail as possible on the action topics, those that told us what had happened before, during, and after the departure from the road. At times, we were able to further raise the cognitive load by asking for a narrated sketch or asking unanticipated questions about what they had observed before the antelope had entered the roadway and what he had done after having crossed the highway. Some of the drivers committed themselves to a wonderful story about a pronghorn having jumped a barbed wire fence immediately before running across the highway in front of them. Some said they had seen the pronghorn jump a fence after having crossed the highway. So why would any of this stuff be important? Well, did you know that the pronghorn had an extremely odd behavior? No, seriously? Well, guess what? Neither did many of the witnesses, and that made them feel comfortable adding details that came more from logic than real memory. You see, our friendly ungulate, that's what the scientists call them, wouldn't have jumped over the barbed wire fencing that lined the highway. Instead, it would have chosen to go under it. Since the species hadn't had to leap over anything taller than sagebrush for ages, it had learned to crawl under the fencing, at times scraping fur and flesh from its back. This meant that a driver who chose to tell us he had seen the pronghorn jump over a fence had provided information inconsistent with the known behavior of this species. Consequently, We would present a non-accusatory challenge that asked the driver to help us understand the inconsistency between the reported jump over the fence and the known pronghorn behavior of taking the low road. We remained polite and maintained a conversational tone at all times, and many of these witnesses chose to modify the original account by saying the pronghorn had in fact gone under the fence. Others fully admitted that although they had indeed seen pronghorn, none of them had been on the highway. Many chose to come clean by saying they had veered into the ditch after having momentarily fallen asleep at the wheel. By committing the driver to a detailed account, we were able to challenge him with a discrepancy, resulting often in the choice to modify his account. It's important to note that we did not interrogate any of the drivers who said they had not seen what the pronghorn had been doing before it had entered the road, as our goal was only to judge the situation from what the witness could tell us. We never told anyone that they were lying, nor did we accuse them of having fallen asleep at the wheel. Now, this is not to say that we didn't use their words as part of a credibility assessment for the incident report when deciding on a balance of probabilities whether we favored their version over other probable scenarios. The student said he was happy with my story. I was happy that it had come so quickly, and the pronghorn, well, let's just say he was happy to avoid getting a ticket for leaping without due care and attention. Last I heard, our pronged friend was living in the Medicine Hat area after having retired from his job as a bass player in a country band named the Crawling Pronghorns. You may have heard their first hit, a little ditty called "Don't Fence Me In." That's all, folks. Cheers.
I want to ride to the ridge where the west commences and gaze at the moon until I lose my senses. I can't look at hobbles and I can't stand fences. Don't fence me in.